Here we go.
Great. Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes for everybody to be able to log in, and then we'll get started soon enough. All right, well, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here. We're having a webinar on our current exhibition on printmaking in the age of Durer. My name is Caroline Koch. I am a master's student in the Department of Art History in my first year here at Penn State. And so throughout this webinar, you can ask a question whenever you would like using the chat function, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the session. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone to this museum conversation relating to the exhibition Printmaking in the Age of Durer, an exhibition that opened a few weeks ago and will extend through, gosh, sometime in May. I apologize, I've forgotten things. Now, we're going to start with the image that was on the title page. It's Durer's Melancholia 1 from 1514. We select this image because a very fine example of melancholia is on long-term loan to the museum from a private collection. And as soon as we received this print in the museum, we immediately recognized the quality of the image itself, this particular sheet, and decided that we really shouldn't keep it to ourselves, that it's something that we wanted to share with our audiences. And so immediately began planning this particular exhibition in which Melancholia 1 would be the focal point. Now, Melancholia is one of 3 master engravings by Albrecht Dürer. They're called master because they represent Dürer's achievements as an engraver. They're really the pinnacle of his efforts as a printmaker. On the left is Night, Death, and the Devil, in which a warrior proceeds steadily ahead, resolute in the face of both death and the devil, who is poised behind him. In the center, St. Jerome in his study, the 4th century scholars going about his work translating the Bible into Latin. That's the Vulgate that was created by St. Jerome. And on the right-hand side are Melancholia 1, which is a very different work than the other 2. And it's easily the most enigmatic of the 3 master engravings. Now, this particular example of Melancholia is really quite special. More than likely, it's what we call a lifetime image, printed during Durer's lifetime, and certainly by him himself, if indeed it was printed before 1528. If you had this sheet in front of you, the image doesn't do it justice, but if you were able to come to the museum and look very carefully at this particular engraving, you would see immediately that it's a very dark image. All the lines are printing very clearly, which suggests that it's a very early pull off the plate that was used to engrave Melancholia. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was engraved during or printed during Durer's lifetime, because certainly his plates were printed well after his death in 1528. But there's another aspect to this sheet that we discovered once we had it at the museum that really puts it in the era of Dürer, and that's the watermark. It's an embedded design in paper Manufacturer's mark tells people who are interested in paper that this was made by a particular company or person. And near the center of the print, right about there where the puto is residing on top of the wheel, there's this small jug watermark, and it's exactly the kind of paper that Dürer used during the final decade of his life. And so we're pretty comfortable that if it wasn't printed by Dürer, it was printed soon after his death, perhaps by his wife, who lived on for a number of years, or other people in his household. But nonetheless, it's a very early image, and because of that, a spectacular representation of Melancholia 1. Melancholia is also rather problematic in that scholars have been addressing this particular engraving for nearly 5 centuries. It's half a millennium. And over that time, they've yet to come up with an interpretation that satisfies everyone. Now, it's just rich in imagery. For example, there at the top right-hand corner, you have a bell. Traditionally, bells are used to call people to prayer. There's a magic square just beneath the bell. A magic square, 16 squares with numbers, and all of those numbers, whether tallied horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, add up to the number 34. And I've yet to see an interpretation that explains why that is. There's an hourglass, a typical symbol of the passage of time. There are scales illustrating some kind of justice that's in play. A ladder, usually employed to depict spiritual ascent. There are a pair of calipers used for measurement, and in tandem with those, these geometric forms which suggest that mathematics are in play somehow. And look at all of these tools of carpentry scattered about the floor in a rather haphazard manner. Carpentry, of course, these tools used to build things or to make things, and therefore suggestive perhaps of the efforts of the artist. All of these and many, many more, we could go on and list all kinds of things that are present in this sheet. All of them are usually interpreted within the context of the sheet's title. This is the only time that Dürer actually titled, I think, oh, I'm sorry, there was one other image where he used the title, but that are very rare for Dürer to title his sheets Melancholia 2, I'm sorry, 1, there in a banner that's carried by a flying bat. Don't know what the bat is all about. And this is really where we can begin to at least share some possibilities for the print. That brooding figure in that dominates the engraving, this winged female figure, perhaps an angel, sitting down with this rather again brooding character, lost in thought, perhaps staring out into space. I'm certainly not happy, but we don't know really what this gesture is, what she's thinking about, and how she relates to the rest of the imagery in the sheet. Now, since antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, melancholy was regularly understood as one of the 4 temperaments. Persons diagnosed either as sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, or melancholic, they were diagnosed that if they had some kind of imbalance of one of the 4 bodily fluids. Melancholics were described as having a preponderance of black bile, too much black bile that's overbalancing their system. And this led to sadness and despair, delusion, and eventually mental illness. Persons with melancholy were described as awkward, miserly, spiteful, greedy, malicious, cowardly, faithless, irreverent, and drowsy. In Renaissance thought, though, and this is the time in which Dürer is working, this diagnosis evolved considerably. Marcellino Ficino, late 15th century Florentine philosopher, he died in 1499. Ficino believed that most intellectuals were melancholic. Indeed, he felt that melancholy was the sign of genius. Another leading scholar of the day, Cornelius Agrippa, and he was almost a direct contemporary of Dürer, wrote about 3 levels of melancholia: imagination, reason, and intellect. And he placed artists in that first level where imagination dominates over reason and intellect. And perhaps it's been suggested that these understandings of melancholia in the late 15th and early 16th century were the reason for the title Melancholia I, as though this was part of Agrippa's understanding of an artist's imagination. Nonetheless, with this in mind, it's probably safe to say that Dürer considered, at least in part, this print to be a self-portrait, because Dürer is certainly an artist of high repute and high intellect indeed, and was probably melancholic himself, likely considered this to be a representation of either artists or the artist himself. Now, Dürer was well aware of Ficino's and Agrippa's writings, and many others as well. He circulated and conversed with the leading intellects of Nuremberg, and knew them well, and was although he did not attend university, he so therefore wasn't trained in academia. He knew several individuals who conversed about the leading intellectual thoughts of the day. Let's just a few words on Dürer, and I offer you two self-portraits from 1493 on the left, and from just 5 years later, 1498 on the right. We tend to forget, working with Dürer's prints, that he was a splendid artist, a splendid painter. He was well trained as a painter, and received a great deal of commissions, from portraiture all the way up to altarpieces, and could have easily made a living as a painter, but decided to go in another direction. Eventually, actually, continued to paint, but really emphasized his printmaking as opposed to painting. He was born in 1471 in Nuremberg, which at the time was one of the largest cities of the Holy Roman Empire. And remember, at that time, the Holy Roman Empire was all of Central Europe, and not only Germany and Austria, but also the current day Czech Republic, parts of Poland, parts of France, and reaching down into northwestern Italy. It was a huge empire, and Nuremberg was one of the major cities, as much as 45,000 people at the time of Dürer's life. Dürer's father was a goldsmith, and quite naturally, he followed in his father's footsteps, at least initially, and as a young teenager, apprenticed with his father to go into his father's business. Now, goldsmithing, of course, is the making of objects with precious metals, jewelry, small sculpture, etc., but also utilized engraving as a means of decorating those objects. And so Dürer already had a leg up on training as a printmaker because of his skills that he developed as a goldsmith. Following his work with his father, it was decided that goldsmithing was not the direction for Dürer, but rather, because of his talents, he really should be an artist. And so he was sent in November 1486 to train with Michael Wohlgemuth, who was the most important painter in Nuremberg, and that's saying that he was one of the most significant painters in the Holy Roman Empire. Wohlgemuth ran a huge shop in Nuremberg. He also, in addition to utilizing his apprentices and journeymen in the workshop to help him with his paintings, his workshop was expert in creating designs for woodcuts. There was also a stable of wood carvers, to realize those designs. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about Dürer's woodcuts in just a minute. Dürer stayed with Wohlgemuth for almost 4 years, between almost 4 years, 3.5 years, from 1486 to April of 1490. But at that point in his training, it was time for him to start his journeyman years, years in which he was expected to move outside of Nuremberg and experience other artists' work and other art workshops throughout Germany. He elected first to go to Colmar because he wanted to work with Martin Schongauer, perhaps at the time one of the best known engravers in all of Europe. Unfortunately, Schongauer died before Dürer was able to meet with him. So he stayed in Colmar with Schondauer's brothers, who were also artists and goldsmiths, and worked in their workshops for a couple of years as a journeyman. He then traveled to Basel in Switzerland, and then Strasbourg to do the same thing, work with other artists in their workshops as a journeyman. Now, keep in mind that he was not only training, improving his training as an artist, but he was also creating works of art. Already winning commissions for painting, but also developing a lot of designs, a lot of drawings that were turned into woodcuts, particularly in Strasbourg. In late 1493, he was called back home to Nuremberg because it was time for him to get married. Now, it was an arranged marriage and a necessary thing for artists, because in order to open your own workshop, particularly in Nuremberg, marriage was a prerequisite. And so his family arranged for him to marry a woman named Agnes Frey. And in 1494, July 7th, the two of them were married. And then Dürer immediately went off to Italy to continue his training, spending most of his time in Venice and in other parts of northern Italy. By 1495, he was back in Nuremberg, at which time he opened his own workshop in the city of Nuremberg, and very quickly developed into one of the city's leading artists. As you can see from two of these self-portraits, he was an exceptional painter. And on the right-hand side, the clothing that he wears was purposefully selected to illustrate at a young age. In 1498, he's just still, 27 years old, that he was a very successful artist as well. Again, he's winning commissions for portraits, for altarpieces. He even worked for many years as a court artist for Maximilian I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. But he preferred to spend his time making prints. And it wasn't that he was, in addition, I guess, in addition to being drawn to the graphic arts, the real reason why he spent a lot of time making prints is because he could make more money from them, and did make more money from them than he did from painting. His prints were recognized during his lifetime as some of the finest graphic representations in all of Europe, and collectors, and there were collectors at this time, grabbed them up. He often couldn't keep them in stock. He printed them, of course, when he thought he could sell them. He sent his wife off to, for example, book fairs, and had him sell his prints. He was very well known as a printmaker, better well known as a printmaker than he was a painter. And this is how we best know Dürer, as a maker of engravings and a designer of woodcuts. Now, let's talk a little bit about engraving. On the left-hand side, you see a copper plate, and on top of them, three engraving burins. The handle rests in the palm, and the fingers rest along the shaft of the burin, a steel shaft, which is sharpened at an angle to create an incredibly sharp point at the very edge, which can be used to plow into the copper sheet. Now, copper is very soft, and so it goes through them when the steel shafts are sharpened, goes through it rather readily. But keep in mind that when engraving, the artist is going to have this sheet of copper on a pillow, and so the burin often remains steady in the hand, and the artist turns the pillow in order to create a lot of the image. On the right-hand side, you see a copper plate, one of only two plates that are still extant of Dürer's work, a copper plate for a portrait of Philipp Melanchthon in 1526. It's hard to read, but the design that you see on the surface of that plate is what that Dürer would have used with his burin to engrave. He would have cut and sized all of those lines into the copper plate. When he was finished, he would have then applied ink, a pasty ink, applied with a cloth, and forced ink into these engraved lines, wiped the plate clean, leaving the ink in the lines, and then printing it. to create this portrait. It's an intaglio process, which means that ink lies below, or the ink is placed in incisions below the surface. And again, here is this portrait of Philippe Melanchthon. Again, it's an engraving that is not a part of the show. I use it just simply to illustrate engravings. One of the fine engravings that is in the show is this early work by Durer. It's Saint Jerome penitent in the wilderness from about 1496. And so he is creating this really just a year or so after he opened his workshop. And already in this early engraving, you can see Durer working to create a Renaissance aesthetic that can be differentiated from the way that artists worked prior to the Renaissance or prior to the 15th century. The figure of Saint Jerome is naturalistically depicted within a rather rational space, landscape actually created from sketches that he made in the Alps and also near his hometown of Nuremberg. And the goal is to create this illusion of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface, such as the sheet of paper here. It's almost as though the edges of the sheet form a window through which we can logically view the image of Saint Jerome performing his penance. Now, compare that to this engraving by Israel van Meckenem, Van Meckenem, also in the exhibition, Christ shown to the people from about 1480. Meckenem was an older contemporary of Durer, but I think you can tell just by looking at this that Meckenem was adhering fairly much to an earlier aesthetic, which had more to do with depicting figures that were not as rationally set within the space. If, for example, and let me just do this very quickly, and I take off my glasses so I can see if I have yes, I have the pointer here. I'm up here at the top, and you can see this wall behind the figure to the left. At the top, it engages with the wall behind the figure to this figure, this person's right, at a right angle. But if you follow the corner of that engagement all the way down, where's that wall? It disappears. It disappears behind this person. And instead, this wall continues theoretically the whole width of this staircase. Similarly, over here to the right, where you have Herod, a second version of Herod, speaking with his wife, the arch, does it fall over this doorway, or is it helping to describe this space that's behind this wall? The figures are very elongated, not very naturalistically portrayed, and the expressions on a lot of these characters in the crowd are more caricatures than actual depictions of human faces. So there's a big difference between Meckenem and Durer. Durer fully engaging with Renaissance aesthetic. Two more prints at really the pinnacle of Durer's work with engraving. Christ before Caiaphas from the engraved Passion, created in 1512, and on the right-hand side, Saints Peter and John healing an individual. Now, Durer created three Passion series, two woodcuts. We'll talk more about the other one of the others in a moment, and this one, which was an engraving. The Passion is a series of events that occurred during the final hours of the life of Jesus. Those moments from Passover all the way up to his crucifixion, and then resurrection 3 days later. On the left, you have Passover evening when Christ has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and brought to the high priest of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the supreme Jewish council in Jerusalem. To the high priest, his name is Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, who condemns him for his preaching, his teaching. He's then brought to Herod, which is the Meckenem series that we saw just before, Meckenem image that we saw just before, and presented. And Herod finds no reason to hold him, but the crowd cries for his crucifixion, and so Herod sends him off to be crucified. So On the right-hand side, the story of James and John and Peter healing is not a part of the Passion. It's actually an extra print, the same size of all the others in the Passion, that traditionally is added to the Passion because it has nowhere else to go. It's a one of. Durer created, we think, because he wanted, after finishing the Passion, he wanted to create a series on the Acts of the Apostles. This was the only one that he created, and so it's part of the Passion group, but it's not a Passion story. Now, match these images. These are the smallest engravings, pretty much, yeah, they are the smallest engravings that Durer did, with one of the largest that his contemporary Sebald Boehm executed. On the left is a very fine engraving, Adam and Eve. This is this is actually the first gift from the Friends that we have on view here. It is a spectacular image. The Friends did good with this one in 1979. But note the size of the print, just 3¼ inches high, compared to Durer's smallest image, was as 4 5/8 inches high. So it's again one of Boehm's largest images. And the reason I point this out is because Sebald Boehm, together with his brother Bartel, and then several others, including Georg Pence, also working in Nuremberg and other areas at the time, were called little masters. They're called that because of their propensity to work on small scale. They very much appreciated engraving's capability to create images with enough detail so that you could create them in small scale. And it became a specialization on the part of a number of artists during the early years of the 16th century. Boehm's Adam and Eve is actually a copy of his brother Barton's image. You can see the one on the right-hand side, Adam and Eve, that Bartel created in about 1525. It's exactly the same size, and the imagery is copied as precisely as Boehm could do. I think Boehm did a better job with the engraving. But what happened is that Bartel died in 1540. So he died at the age of 38. He was Sebald was the older brother. Sebald inherited the plates and often reprinted them, he reworked them, and he copied them. It's just we'll talk more about copies in a bit, but it's not an uncommon occurrence for people to copy other artists' imagery. Now, the image for, yeah, it's getting late, gosh, I might even get through the engravings. The image for Adam and Eve was influenced very much by Albrecht Dürer's engraving of the same topic. They're on the right-hand side, bypassing the imagery, the quality of the imagery itself. Suffice to say that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center, from which, of course, both Eve and Adam eat, even though they weren't supposed to, has been transformed into a tree of death. You see the skeleton has replaced the tree, even though you still have the snake. You have the snake offering the fruit to Adam and Eve. Nonetheless, this is a rather lugubrious reinterpretation of Dürer's print, again on a very small scale. Note the difference in size. Dürer's image is almost 10 inches tall. Boehm's is 3¼ And so if we were to see them on the wall, this would be the proper scale. Boehm, much smaller, of course, a little master than the scale that Dürer would often work. 2 more prints in the exhibition. Probably the smallest images that Boehm worked. These are barely an inch and a half high, an inch wide. Market peasant on the left-hand side. Very typical subject matter for engraving in the early parts of the 15th century, but again, no larger than a postage stamp. On the right, an unknown artist making a copy of Boehm's print, same title, same image, and they are very difficult to discern. Why the copy? Several reasons. One, the artist might be trying to test his or her, probably his, skill against the engraving skill of Boehm. More than likely, these images sold. These are very popular images. And the artist was attempting to create an image that he might be able to pass off as an image by Bayham. If you see, though, there in the center, what he didn't do on the right-hand side, he didn't copy Bayham's signature. So that's something to think about. We'll get back to copies in just a bit. Now, the Bayham is actually part of a diptych. There are two sheets that go hand in hand that should be seen side by side, both of market peasants, one the male, one the female. And if you saw them side by side and then took a look at how the banner read across both prints, it just simply says, if we sell their rights, their things at the market, well, then we can buy wine. That's a mildly humorous approach to peasantry in the early to mid years of the 16th century. Now, let's quickly move on to woodcuts. Preponderance of engravings and woodcuts in the exhibition, with which Dürer excelled in the production. This is a spectacular woodcut, the first work of art that the Friends of the Palmer Museum of Art acquired for the museum. In 1975, it was the first image bought with funds provided by the Friends, and the museum did real good with this one. It's a truly spectacular image of Dürer's Lamentation from the large Passion. It's a woodcut carved in about 1499 and printed certainly before 1511, when the entire series of the Passion was collected together in a book and sold in that manner. Dürer, as he had these blocks carved and then cut and then printed, would sell them as individual sheets before the entire series was done because people wanted them. And so he could make money before the entire series was printed. And we know that this one was printed well before 1511, and I'll get to that in a moment. His woodcuts of this time, starting with the Apocalypse, which he created in 1498, and then the Life of the Virgin, we'll talk about in a second, and in this large Passion, all of them were hugely popular throughout all of Europe, not just in Germany, but all over Europe. And they sold widely, and everywhere. People just couldn't get enough of it. He learned this craft in when he was working with Michael Wohlgemuth. Wohlgemuth, remember, had a large stable of they're called Formschneiders, of wood carvers. The carvers in wood, it was a specialization, that was a guild in Nuremberg and in other cities that really specialized in carving wood. And so even though Dürer may have experimented once in a while with cutting his own wood blocks, he did not develop the level of skill necessary to continue doing that. And he would hand over his designs or draw directly on the block of wood and then hand over the block to be carved by other individuals who specialized in that particular tradition. Now, I mentioned Wohlgemuth, and another print in the show is this sheet from the Last Judgment, a sheet titled The Last Judgment from the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was printed in 1493, published by a man named Anton Koberger, who incidentally was Albrecht Dürer's godfather. Koberger and Dürer's father were both goldsmiths. As a matter of fact, they lived like a block from one another in Nuremberg prior to Koberger's shift from goldsmithing to printing and publication. He switched over a year before Dürer was born in 1470 and became one of the leading citizens of Nuremberg. Indeed, he was the most prolific publisher for a long time in the entire Holy Roman Empire. 26 presses and publishing tons of things, including this Nuremberg Chronicle from 1493. It was designed either by Michael Wohlgemuth or his stepson, Wilhelm Platenwerf. We don't know who, but similarly to the comparison that we had before with Durer's St. Jerome and Meckenham's Ecce Homo, presentation of Christ to the people, the aesthetic of Wohlgemuth really adheres to an earlier approach to figures. Again, they're described as late Gothic. The characters are elongated and thin, and represented in a much more angular way, and therefore less naturalistically than the way that Durer presents his figures in the Lamentation. Let's see, just a moment, just a word on the imagery. You see, it's a dualistic presentation. The Last Judgment is when the souls of everyone will be judged to decide whether or not they can be admitted to heaven or they are condemned to hell. There is Christ in the center, the risen Christ. To his right or left is Mary, the Virgin Mary, his mother, and on the right is St. John the Baptist. And you see two images seem to be emanating from his ear. On the left-hand side, or our left-hand side, is a lily, and on the right-hand side is a sword. And you can guess which is which. If you have done well, you are on the lily side, you get to go to heaven. If you didn't, you're on the sword side, and you can see devils in the earth pulling those individuals who are condemned to hell toward their demise. Just a word on woodcutting. On the left, you have gouges and chisels that are used to create a wood block, similar to a burin, but these are flatter and are used to really carve away wood than plow through metal. And the right-hand side is one of the many wood blocks that still exist for Durer's work. This is a pearwood block for Samson rending the lion. It resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you look carefully up here, especially in these blank areas, you can see how the carver has taken out large chunks of wood, and those will be left white. This is the block when the carving is finished, because the image itself resides in relief, rather than running it through an etching press, which has a great deal of pressure. This image is inked with a roller, not forcefully, but just on the top where the image resides, and then run through a different type of press with less pressure to yield this particular image, Samson rending the lion, a woodcut from 1497 to 1498. This is a relief print. It's therefore very different in terms of the way it was made than an etching or an engraving, but it gives you, again, a very nice representation of the image of Samson and the lion in relief, as opposed to as an intaglio. The Samson rending lion is not a part of the exhibition. I use it just here to illustrate how woodcuts are made. Now, getting back to our Lamentation, I mentioned that we know that this image was pulled rather early from the blocks by Durer. On the right-hand side, it's a spectacular image, very dark. Compare that to the Lamentation, exactly the same image on the left-hand side, again, printed, made about 1499, but this is from the 1511 publication, probably printed a little bit later than that, because you can see the ink is very light. It's probably because of the printing, the constant printing of this block. The image, the wood itself is starting to hold less of the ink that's rolled onto it. And also, if you look up close to the tree, you can have the text that was printed in the 1511 version that's showing through on the other side. Here you have the various lines of text on the opposite. This was published in book form with the imagery of the Passion on the verse, or the sheet that holds the woodcut, and on the reverse you have recto, and on the reverse, the verso, you have text that describes the various scenes of the Passion, and that's how the Passion, or the whole Passion, was published in book form in 1511. So this image is at least from 1511. Getting back to our Lamentation and compared to another image that was printed much later, if you look very closely over to the left on this version right here, you can see that there's a crack that has appeared. This line is actually from the block itself that has cracked at this point, and so it's not holding any ink. This crack started to appear well before the 1511 book came out, and as described on sheets that Dürer pulled later, but before 1511. So we know that this sheet was pulled after the sheet on the right-hand side, and because of its condition, there are a lot of losses here. It probably was printed closer to around 1600. Again, the blocks survived well past Dürer's death. A couple of other woodcuts before we conclude. This is another woodcut in the show by Hans Balding, created in 1519 from a series that he did on the Apostles. Interesting, the reason why this is in the show, first of all, it's a spectacular image, but also Balding was an apprentice to Dürer. He was in Dürer's workshop between 1503 and 1507. When Dürer took his trip to Italy, second trip to Italy in 1505, Balding was asked to manage the workshop. And so Dürer thought highly of Balding, enough so that he trusted his workshop to the artist. This image is of St. Paul, who was a writer of several of the New Testament books. He was a Roman citizen, and so when he was told to stop preaching and neglected the warning, he was killed, as many Christians were. Normally, Christians would have been crucified, but you see, Paul was a Roman citizen, and so he was offered the benefit of a very quick death. He was decapitated. So you have the two images, images that are allied with Paul, the book, the New Testament, and then the sword. And you can see with both of these, the way that St. Paul seems to stumble. It's kind of like he's yielding to this weight of the book and the sword, and that yield is both an actual one. He's struggling to hold on to them, but it's also metaphorical, you see, because the whole idea of battling to the pagans, the Romans, to continue to teach the Christ's word is also a metaphorical weight that Paul carried with him his entire adult life. And then one more woodcut by Hans Schäffelein, also a apprentice in Dürer's workshop between 1503 and 1507. So he was there the same time as Balding. With this again, another fine image, a good get for the museum. I have never seen another example of this siege of Bethulia, a woodcut from 1530. It describes the story of Judith and Holofernes. Holofernes is laying siege to the city of Bethulia, and no one in the city dares to go out and do battle with Holofernes. Judith, who was recently widowed, goes out by herself and joins Holofernes over there, all the way over here to the right. You can see she's in his tent. She gets him drunk, and then with the help of her servant, she decapitates Holofernes and then drags secretly the head back into the gates of Bethulia, and then has the head put on a pole and over the city. Because when Holofernes' soldiers see his head over the gate, they quickly become disoriented, wondering what's going to happen, and so they are then easily defeated by the soldiers inside the city of Bethulia. And of course, it's because of Judith who has won the day. Back to copying. A few words on copying, and then we'll conclude. Copies were very common in the 15th, 16th century. As a matter of fact, there were very few people thought very much of it. Sometimes it was deceitful. People were making copies, actually, I should say very often, making copies of other people's images strictly to make money. But it was not uncommon, particularly in the 15th century. But it happened a lot to Dürer, and eventually he got fed up with it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Here you have an artist living and working well after Dürer, Johann Wierix, a Flemish artist, making a copy of Melancholia in almost a century later, 1602, an engraving. And this is in the exhibition, and you can look at it. and it's a real fine copy. It's very difficult to see where there's a difference between the way that Vierix is handling the Buren and the way that Dürer does. And it's one of the reasons why we did the show, because we have the Vierix in the exhibit and in our collection, and then we have this loan you see that we can show in tandem with it. Now, in Vierix's case, he wasn't intending to be deceitful at all. He merely copied Dürer, and he copied a lot of Dürer's work so that he could better his skills and then measure his skills against Dürer's. And so it was really a teaching effort on the part of Dürer, on the part of Vierix, teaching himself how to engrave by making copies of the greatest engraver of that up to that time. We know that he didn't intend deceit, that he wasn't creating a forgery, because initially, if you look there at the bottom, his sheet carried his own signature. It says, I can't read it. Oh, here it is. Yes, Johann Vierix Facit, anno 1602. So he says this. Johann Vierix made this in the year 1602. Unfortunately, frequently, as here, you see this lower margin where the signature, where Vierix's signature is signed in the plate, it is trimmed off. It might be because the sheet has been damaged, and so therefore you want to make a clean line at the bottom. More times than not, it's removed because one of the owners of these sheets, maybe in the 17th century, maybe in the 18th century, maybe in the 20th century, has trimmed it and then attempted to pass it off as a Dürer. Of course, the difference in price is huge, and so it really pays if you're intended on passing this off as a Dürer as opposed to a Vierix. In this instance, we really don't know whether or not the lower margin was removed. We don't know what for what purpose, but we can always suspect. And then finally, one other sheet, and then we'll finish. This also in the show is a copy by Marcantonio Raimondi after Albrecht Dürer's Angel Appearing to Joachim, an engraving from that Raimondi did in roughly between 1505 and 1508. Marcantonio made tons of copies after Dürer, dozens of them, while he was still working in Venice between 1506 and 1508. After that point, he went to Rome and he worked with Raphael, engraving a lot of Raphael's designs. And I say thank goodness, because those engravings are often the only record that we have of many of Raphael's designs. And he worked in tandem with Raphael, with Raphael's acquiescence. On the right-hand side, you have the original Dürer, an angel appearing to Joachim from the life of the Virgin, which again also was published in book form in 1511. This sheet was probably carved after Dürer's design around 1504. Now, even though the Dürer sheet is twice the size, look how carefully Marcantonio has copied Dürer. He has copied it as though his sheet was not an engraving, but he made it to look like a woodcut. And more importantly, he also engraved, which is to say copied, Dürer's monogram signature, A.D., which is a bit more suspicious. Was Marcantonio intending to engrave, to forge Dürer's work? Was he intending to pass Dürer's work, his invention, off as his own? Well, according to Giorgio Vasari, an artist and writer in the 16th century, in his 1568 edition of what's called his Lives, the full title is Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, when Dürer heard that Marcantonio was making these copies, he scurried off to Venice in 1506, to petition the Venetian Senate for a cease and desist order. He wanted the Senate to tell Marcantonio to stop doing this. It's probably not true. The archives of the Venetian Senate have no information at all about this kind of stuff, but it's a nice story. In any case, when it came time for Dürer to publish the entire series in 1511, the entire Lives of the Virgin series, he secured a privilege from the Holy Roman Emperor. A privilege is an early form of copyright, saying, this is mine. You can't make a copy of it. You can't use this image. And that allowed him to print print on the final sheet of the book this. And here is Durer's image from Life of the final image, the final print in the Life of the Virgin series. It's Virgin adored by angels and saints. That's an apotheosis, the source of sorts of the angel. It's a woodcut done just before the book was published, 1510. The text in Latin reads this: "Hold, you crafty ones, strangers to work and pilferers of other men's brains. Think not rashly to lay your thievish hands upon my works. Beware, know you not that I have a grant from the most glorious Emperor Maximilian, that not one throughout the imperial dominion shall be allowed to print or sell fictitious imitations of these impressions? Listen, and bear in mind that if you do so through spite or through covetousness, not only will your goods be confiscated, but your bodies also placed in mortal danger." And all of that unfolds in this text and the final sheet of the Lives of the Virgin. Unfortunately for Durer, the Holy Roman Empire did not extend to Venice. So Marc Antonio was free to continue making copies of Durer's work, and he did so for some time. Though curiously, from about 1511 so on, he did so without Durer's monogram. We're still left to wonder whether or not this story is true or how much of it is true. But it's actually a good way to end a presentation on the Prince of Durer. And so with that, I will close my thoughts and be happy to talk about other things.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful illumination of the pieces in this exhibition and similar ones in the context environment that they were created in. So now we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or thoughts or anything, feel free to type something in the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen, and we will go ahead and start. We have a few questions from Simon Dinnerstein. So the first one, let's see, this was referring to the very first slide. Says, do you think Durer was helped or had guidance with the subject matter here? That is with the philosophical underpinnings or the mathematical notions, magic square, etc., for the Melancholia piece.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Of course, that's what people write books about, this print, and they talk a lot about it. It's important to remember at this time, roughly between 1512 and 1516, Durer was thinking an awful lot about not only printmaking, but art in general. He was writing his books on anatomy, and he was talking a lot with tons of folks about this desire to observe nature very carefully and develop the skills to create images that reflect the way that they exist in nature, in this of course illusion of three-dimensionality they talked about before, but also realizing that in making images after with those skills, you are creating something that is different than nature, that is not necessarily true to nature. And indeed, what an artist does, particularly with his imagination or her imagination, is create images that are extra real or super real or differently real. They are recognizable in terms of their images, but you rarely see images in nature the way, or compositions in nature the way that an artist does that. And of course, that's a major difference between art and the real world. And so Durer was thinking a great deal about these kind of things. And so there's no question that not only was he thinking about it, but he was talking to other folks throughout Nuremberg and on his travels about these things. And so, yes, I think that necessarily he would have needed help in understanding a lot of these images, but what that understanding is still perplexing. We don't really have an answer to what he thought about all of these things. He talked only lightly about some of the things in the show. For example, he talked about there are keys there and there's a purse, and he talked about keys in the purse relating to power and access to that power. He wrote about that, but that's about it.
Thank you. The next question is, this is something I was wondering as well. Could you elaborate on when you were discussing how in order for Durer to open a workshop in Nuremberg, he had to be married and sort of
Yeah,
that.
that's my understanding at the time. It was one of the rules. They didn't want bachelors coming in and opening up studios. That they, you know, it was. I don't know the thought behind it, the reason behind it, but being married and essentially therefore theoretically being a point of starting the family, which anchors you to the city, was one of the requirements. And so that's why you frequently see these arranged marriages. Durer's off doing his required journeyman years. He's required to be outside of the city, and so his family arranged for this marriage with Agnes. The reason behind it, I honestly don't understand. But this is pretty much the way things were at the end of the 15th century in Nuremberg, at least. I don't know about other cities.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does the print medium and the look of prints relate to the German personality?
Well, certainly there are ties, relationships between artists that have worked prior to, say, Durer, and the images that he creates afterwards. But in Durer's case, he was very much interested in what was going on in Italy. It's why he made 2 trips there. And he looked very carefully at artists such as Mantegna, Bernini, and spent a lot of time during his days in Italy trying to absorb the theories. Vitruvius, he read, trying to understand anatomy and how to create this image of three-dimensionality, the observation that's turned into this illusion that I talked about. And so he melded several aesthetics, the northern, across the Alps, the northern aesthetic, the northern Renaissance quality, this high Gothic quality of imagery that worked itself well into the 15th and early 16th century, was married to a southern aesthetic. And so even though other artists you can see created work that was tied geographically to the area in which they worked, one of the brilliant aspects of Durer's work is that he synthesized these. And it's why his imagery looks the way it does. And I think for Durer, it's unique to the artist. It's unique, it's new, it really starts with Durer. So I guess that's the best answer I can offer.
Thank you. This next question comes from Johann Federer. In talking about Weir and his copies, did he not include the Durer's AD monogram in his copies?
I'm sorry, whose copies?
Weir.
Wierix? Yeah, Wierix did. Let's see if we could go back here. And I can't see it on my screen because yeah. So if you go over here, and I have to move this over here. I've forgotten actually. I'm sorry, but yes, he did. But where is Durer's monogram? I've lost it for a second. It's down here. Yeah, see over here on the step. There it is, the date and the monogram. So yes, he did copy it. And he's just being true to form. I mean, he was making the copy and he wanted to be true to the image. And so he copied everything. So the answer is yes, he did.
All right. Our next question comes from Jason Kogan. After the 17th century, were there others who tried to copy Durer?
I'm sure there were, but after the 17th century, I think even though there were times in which people became more enamored of Durer and less so, I think that he was far enough removed from the aesthetics that were being produced, for example, in the 18th and 19th century, so that copies were not as prolific if they did so. There would be less of a reason to do so, simply because when you're moving that far away from the Renaissance, the desirability of the image and the ability of people to recognize copies perhaps made it less practical for artists to make copies. I should say, however, that well into the 16th century, other artists were still measuring themselves against Dürer. For example, Wierix was working in the early years of the 17th century, but I'm thinking about Henrik Holsius, who did a series of prints made specifically, not as copies, but as renditions that were very close to the quality of Dürer's engraved lines. Now, he didn't attempt to pass them off as Dürer's work, but a lot of folks mistook some of these engravings for Dürer, and that didn't bother Holsius at all, because Holsius was a very fine engraver, indeed, the finest engraver in Europe after Dürer, chronologically. And so he would make these images in the style of Dürer, and indeed in the style of some other artists, simply because he could, and he was very proud of that aspect. And so it was part of his mindset. But into the 17th century and 18th century, I don't know of anyone who continued to make copies and then pass them off. That doesn't mean they don't exist. I just haven't seen them.
Thank you. And now this next question comes from Linda Gall. She says, early in the presentation, you showed images that you described as being the size of postage stamps. The level of detail was extraordinary, especially considering the small size. Was there a reason that an artist would work on that small scale? Perhaps a cost difference for printing?
I'm not sure that cost was a matter. I think it was just, again, an aesthetic. They're called the Little Masters. It was just a subset. It was just an approach that these individuals made. And it's not uncommon to artists to want to work on that scale. In the 20th century, we still have today artists who pride themselves on working on that small scale. One of the ones that comes to mind immediately is Minna Citrin, who has many, not postage size stamp prints, but very small scale that were made specifically for exhibitions that include other similar work. And so with Bayham especially, I simply think that it was not only a desire on the part of these artists to work on that scale, but they sold. People liked them. People collected them. One of the reasons why Dürer made his engraved Passion so small is because they fit very nicely to be tucked into the pages of similar sized prayer books. We tend to forget that books came of all sizes, and a lot of people carried pocket-sized books and used these prints to decorate them. They would often paste images, particularly if they're religious and it was a religious text, on the inside cover and the backside cover and on the end sheets. So they would use those sheets to paste images. And so small prints could be very readily pasted in a similar way. Now, market peasants, of course, is not going to be something for a Christian text, but I think that aesthetic carried forward into secular imagery because there was a market for it.
Thank you. So that's everything in the Q&A section right now. If anybody has any last minute questions, please, I encourage you to drop something in the Q&A chat box. And while you're doing that, I had a question of my own. I was wondering if Dürer had a preference that you could discern between, I know he often didn't carve the actual wood blocks, but between wood block prints and then the copper etching.
Yeah, gosh, it's a hard one because he, as you know, as you can see from the talk, he excelled with both. And we tend to forget that artists are commercial minded. This is how Dürer made his living. And so his practice is going to be geared toward commerce, geared toward what sells. And there is a market for woodcuts that is very distinct from a market for engravings. You know, an individual's response to a woodcut is, I suspect, and I think that I've seen this elsewhere, is more visceral. It communicates in a way and therefore might have affect a particular sensibility in a way that's very distinct from a more, what's the word that I'm looking for? A more gracious engraving. Engraving has more of a delicate sensibility in which the Buren can create an image that is has more volume, has more illusion of the three-dimensionality. I think there are different types of collectors, and so I think that's why he did both of them. And it's very difficult to determine whether or not he preferred one or the other, because he continued to do both. And he even experimented with etching. But I can tell you, I didn't talk about etching because of time, but I can tell you that he wasn't successful as an etcher. And I think that he didn't respond to it himself as well as he did engraving and woodcutting. Both of them occurred, but the aesthetics occurred early in his training. Even though he was trained as a goldsmith, very early on, he trained in woodcut designing as well. And so I just don't know that there is a way to differentiate his own tastes, other than the fact that a woodcut of a particular image might make more money than engraving of the same, and vice versa.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really interesting. Brought up some new areas I wouldn't have thought of. So where can we access this recording? This will be on the Palmer's YouTube page in about a week. And it should be on there for anyone to view. Could you explain what happened to Durer's copper plates? I happened to see Durer's plate of Philip Melanchthon in Gotha, Germany.
Yes, it's still there. Only 2 plates that I know have survived. Certainly, they were printed after Durer died by his family, and they continue to be passed on to other printers and other collectors. Most of them, the copper plates, they disappeared. Why, we don't know. We know that only one copper plate, and that's the Melanchthon plate in Gotha. And there is one other plate, it's an iron plate, actually, an etching plate that exists, and that is, I can't remember where it is. I do know that it's been brazed in gold. It's a very attractive plate, but most of them have just disappeared, and I think pretty sure for the longest time, those are the only 2 plates that are in existence. There are many more blocks that have been preserved in place, which doesn't stand to reason, because metal is far more resilient than wood, but that's the way it is.
Thank you. So our next question is going to be our last question of the night. This comes from Von Schurk. In Melancholia, on the angular geometric form, there's a ghost-like image. Is that depicting a map of the world as thought of at this time?
Yeah, I don't think so. Some people have tried to make something out of that one. I've looked very carefully at that. I'm looking at it again. The answer is, I don't know, because so many people have talked about all kinds of stuff with this. I don't see it. I don't see a map. I will not argue with you if you see one, Vaughn, because there are all kinds of possibilities, especially with this particular image. So I'm not going to say that that's nonsense. I think it's perfectly possible. I don't see any particular image other than a desire to create a sense of, in my mind, that's just him showing his ability to create texture on that face of the truncated rectangle, or what is that, polyhedron.
All right, thank you. And with that, that's the end of our talk for the night. Thank you again so much to our curator, Dr. Patrick McGrady, for presenting this wonderful look at our exhibition. And thank you everybody for attending this. I hope that you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it.
Thanks for your help, Caroline.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.